somebody who knows these things, but my impression was no. And there was food. Yeah, there was food. There were bagels in a bag. Individually wrapped. Are there more people in the hall? Right. Okay. So, are we ready to start? The first part of this tonight, for our last session, is relatively straightforward, and probably everything I might say you already know. We'll see. The second part, you may not be as familiar with, even though there's been at least one or two times that I've talked about this thinker here at Temple Israel, but he's certainly not as well known as the first one. The first one's name is Theodore Herzl, so I am assuming that everybody has heard of him. Right? Theodore Herzl, known as, what shall we say, the Father of Zionism. A better, more accurate way of putting this would be the father of political Zionism. There are many kinds of Zionism. We tend to equate the term Zionism with political Zionism, meaning the creation of the modern state of Israel. But there are other forms of Zionism also, and we're going to see that in a few minutes when we look at a fellow whose name is Asher Ginsburg. Now, Asher Ginsburg is certainly, probably, almost certainly a name you don't know, but you might know him by his pen name. His pen name is HaAm. That's a little bit more well known. HaAm means one of the people. That's what he went by. His pen name, Asher Ginsburg. He's an Eastern European. Obviously, Theodore Herzl is a Central European. That's going to make a big difference in this discussion, I think, as we proceed. And what my hope is tonight, where the previous 3 weeks was, my hope was to expose you to some theological ideas that either you hadn't been exposed to before, or if you had, I was trying to expose them to you within a framework in which they might be sort of provocative jumping off points, maybe even helpful to your own theological thinking, right? So we looked at somebody who said it's more reasonable to believe in God than not, even though he couldn't prove it. We looked at somebody who said, from an experience point of view, cultivating your sense of amazement leads you to the experience of God. Someone else who said cultivating your sense of person-to-person relationship leads you to God, right? We looked at someone who said Judaism is a civilization, and what really matters is that we think of Judaism in the same way that we think of science, and that God is the force, what did we say? The force that makes for salvation, and salvation he defined as essentially reaching our full potential as human beings. And who else did we look at? Who was the last one besides Amar? Oh, we looked at Richard Rubinstein, who puts the Holocaust front and center, sees it as the challenge to any belief in God, and Emil Fackenheim, who agrees with everything that Rubinstein said except for his conclusion. According to Fackenheim, there is other experience which is more powerful, which we can't ignore, which he called, remember, the 614th commandment. So this is a little different, right? We're going to look at something that obviously is very close to me, very near and dear to me, which is trying to come to some basic understanding about this unprecedented event in modern Jewish life, actually almost in Jewish history, which is the creation of the State of Israel. We sort of take it for granted. But if you can imagine yourself living before the State of Israel, some of you don't have to imagine it. I was born in 1950, so it was a fact when I was born, but it was still a pretty new fact, and not a fact that got discussed a great deal, at least in the Jewish circles that my family lived in St. Louis. But if you go back before that, the notion of there actually being Jewish sovereignty in its own state was really a very radical idea. Very radical idea. And I want to start with that so that we understand who Theodore Herzl was. Right? You see his dates? I'm looking at page 109, if you have, so that you have the correct compendium first. And you see, he lived from 1860 to 1904. 44 years old. He died a very, very young man. It's pretty remarkable what he did accomplish. He also was sort of famous for saying that he thought within 50 years of his death, his dream would come true. Right? Pretty close, don't you think? Pretty close. He was within 4 years of that being reality, even though, sadly, he didn't live to see it. Although he is buried in Jerusalem, and those of you that have visited Jerusalem, I'm pretty sure they took you there to what's called Mount Herzl. It's sort of this high point in this major military cemetery. Cemetery is mostly filled with military personnel, but also a lot of politicians. It's a fascinating cemetery. It's the only cemetery I know of where a general can be buried next to a private. There must be others in the world. But it's no big deal in Israel. Serve in the IDF, you serve in the IDF, you're entitled to be buried there. Okay, so what is Herzl trying to do? You can read this if you would like. I'm going to try to summarize it because I think it's easier. Herzl wrote a very important little pamphlet, really. It's not even the length of a novella, which was called what? Judenstaat. Now, my German is pretty weak, actually non-existent. But what does Judenstaat mean? What do you translate it? And this is a very key thing. How do you translate it? Do you translate it as the Jewish state or the state of Jews? Now, the reason I say that, apparently both are legitimate. Jewish state implies a state whose character is Jewish. A state of Jews says something about the demographics of the state, made up of members of the Jewish people. I am pretty much convinced that that's what Herzl meant, however you decide to translate it. What I'm basing that on are his actual ideas of what he says in Judenstaat. And then he says in his second book, which almost no one ever looks at. It's called, I think it's called Alt Neuland, which means the old new land, which, by the way, is the way you should understand the translation of the modern city Tel Aviv. I know, what does Tel Aviv mean? What's a tel? Not just any hill. What's a tel? Not just any mound. It's an archaeological mound, right? It's the old. It's the alt. And what's Aviv? Spring, renewing life. It's the new. So Tel Aviv is actually following out this idea of Herzl from the book Alt Neuland, in which he sort of describes what he thinks this state is going to be. And it's nothing like what you imagine if you're thinking about the modern state of Israel or what you might have concocted as a Jewish state. He sort of sees it as a Central Western European country that's probably going to speak German, and in this country they are going to be world leaders in terms of culture. That instead of the rebuilding of the Third Temple, there'll be a great university, a great academy. You get the kind of thinking, very 19th century Central European thinking. So that was really what his idea was, but he wanted to create a state for Jews. Now, why did he want to create a state for Jews? What's the story you've all heard? Right. So everyone has heard. Did everybody hear what Rita said? I'll repeat it because it's easier than Rita standing up and shouting. Everybody has heard the story that Herzl, I'm going to say a little more than you said. Herzl, I always say a little more than you say. Herzl was a highly assimilated Austrian Jew. There's no question about that. He comes from a highly, extremely assimilated Central European Jewish background. Okay? And the story, the way it's usually told, is he is radicalized when, as a journalist, he covers the Dreyfus trial. I guess we'd have to say the first Dreyfus trial in France. Who is Dreyfus? Alfred Dreyfus. Do we know who he is? Alfred Dreyfus is also a highly, extremely assimilated Jew. I've heard him described as more French than any born Frenchman that ever lived. That's who he was. But what happens to him? He is convicted on trumped-up charges, no pun intended, on trumped-up charges of what? Treason. He is convicted and he is sent to Devil's Island. And this doesn't happen just once, it happens twice, because there's a movement that grows that considers this an injustice and gets him a second trial, and he's convicted again. And it's only in a third go-around that he's ultimately exonerated. And why does that radicalize Herzl, according to the story? Herzl looks at Dreyfus and says, obviously, the tactic of solving anti-Semitism through assimilation is doomed. It cannot work. Does that make sense to everybody? He sees Dreyfus. Now, the truth is, I believe this is historical truth, that Herzl already had these ideas before he covered the Dreyfus trial. There's some of his writings and some other things that scholars have looked into very carefully, and it's not as if Herzl was one thing on Tuesday, covered the trial on Wednesday, and was somebody else on Thursday. That's not what happened. This was a much more developmental kind of thing, that Herzl was coming to see that the assimilationist point of view as a solution to what was then called, and really well up into the mid-20th century, even I would say into the 70s, was called what? The Jewish problem. The only solution, which the strategy of assimilation was not going to work. Do we have that? Does that make sense to everybody? It was not going to work. Now, this is important to us as Reformed Jews, because what are we accused of as Reformed Jews? By almost all the other religious streams. We are accused of being assimilationists. And I have a secret for you. It's true. I don't think it's a terrible thing, but it's true. And so we clean it up. Like in my whole rabbinate over 40 years, I cleaned it up. I said we're really all about acculturation rather than assimilation. But that's just changing vocabulary to make it sound nice. In other words, the Reform movement said, looking at all of Jewish history, that the Jewish people and Judaism make leaps forward when it figures out how to take the best of the culture that it's living within and find a way to acculturate it, to bring it into Judaism and to make a new set point, and then it moves on from there. And I could demonstrate that to you over and over and over again throughout Jewish history. It's not a hard thing. It's not a hard thing to do. But those who call us assimilationists, and they range in vehemence, and depending on whether you're talking about the ultra-Orthodox back through more traditionals. This, by the way, just happened recently in Israel when Naftali Bennett was named prime minister. How did the ultra-Orthodox, what epithet did they throw at him to delegitimize him? That he's a reformer. That he's no better than a reformed Jew. They actually said that out loud. Among other things, nastier, that they said about him. And the people aligned with him. Anyhow, Herzl understands at some point, let's call it around the time of the Dreyfus trial, that assimilation will not solve the Jewish problem. So he sets about to figure out how to solve the Jewish problem. How can we solve anti-Semitism? And what's his answer? It's a funny kind of thing. We have to make the Jewish people like every other people. That sort of sounds assimilationist, doesn't it? How does he mean? Let me see if I can sort of put this in a simple way. Does it make sense to talk about being, if you're born and living in Italy, about being anti-Italian? I suppose it could. You could have issues with aspects of the culture or different, but there's no anti-Italianism. Why? Because the Italians have the one thing that a people needs that the Jewish people does not have. A land, let's say two things. I think they're two sides of the same coin. A land and a state. You could say the same thing about being anti-Polish in Poland. The Polish people have a land and a state. And so therefore, you can be pro or con about aspects of Polish life or Polish people or the like, but everybody knows Poland is for the Poles. Italy is for the Italians. However, this one people on earth, called the Jews or the Jewish people, doesn't have what? A land or a state. That's why he called it Judenstaat. In his opinion, he needed a state for Jews so that Jews, in his opinion, of course they will all go live in that state. Why would they all go live in that state? Because there would be no anti-Semitism there. And from his perspective, there was anti-Semitism everywhere. So if you want to escape this terrible thing, anti-Semitism, if we have a Jewish state and Jews live in the Jewish state, just like Poles in the Polish state and Italians in the Italian state, we have solved the problem of anti-Semitism. Doesn't it sound good? What's wrong with it? Okay, so what Aaron said is there are already people living on that land. There actually was not really a state there. There was sovereignty, but it depends on whether you want to talk about the time of Turkish sovereignty or British sovereignty, or whether you want to go back even further when it was Syrian sovereignty. There were different sovereignties there, but there was not a state. Okay, that's one problem, but I think that is not in the first two rows, please. Richard, not in the first two rows. You have to move backwards. Thank you. It's because I don't want to be accused of having breathed on anybody. Yes, it's social distancing. Because I can't stand still. So I have to wander around. So okay, thank you. Okay, so there's that problem, but I think that's the second level of a problem. The first level of the problem is what? No, you have to get a state. The very first thing, if the state is going to be the solution, you have to create a program to get a state. We take this for granted now. I think a lot of us, because it's just always been there or for a long time. But think about this. There was no state. He says we have to create a state. You have to figure out how to do that. And I think his great accomplishment, having worked in the Jewish community for 40 plus years, I consider this an unbelievable accomplishment. It's a Herculean task. It's like one of the trials of Hercules, is he managed to create something called the World Jewish what is it called? I've lost it. It's not really the World Jewish Congress, but it's I can't hear you, Tina. World Zionist Congress. Thank you. Thank you. You'd think I would remember that. I've even been a delegate to it. Anyhow, I told you, it's what happens when you get into your 70s. These things get lost. Anyhow, can you imagine getting Jews from all over the world to come and sit together in common cause? Can we get the 2 Reformed congregations in Dayton to sit together in common cause? Herzl, through force of personality and energy, tireless effort, I believe that's why he died at 44, traveled the country, raising money, trying to develop political influence, talking to any government leader who would talk to him, talking to the heads of Jewish communities, talking, until he finally got the first World Zionist Congress. 1897, if I remember right. Might have been 98. And in this World Zionist Congress, they agreed to working to the establishment of a state. At that point, there was no name for it yet. It was unclear what the name was going to be. Some people wanted the name to be Zion. Other people wanted the name to be Israel. There was all sorts of possibilities as to what the name could have been. But they would work towards it, and they began to put into place concrete things to make that state come about. For example, let's see if I can think of one that you know. The JNF. What is the JNF? Jewish National Fund. You've heard of that? Remember the little blue boxes? When I was a kid, they were made out of tin. Now they're made out of cardboard. I wonder what that says. But they were made out of tin, and everybody had them in their house, and you put little pushkas that you put charity money in. My grandmother had one in the kitchen at all times. And Jews were, on whatever level, obviously the state didn't get built on nickels, dimes, and quarters, but were contributing to a fund to purchase land until the British mandate, it's not really called Palestine. Let's just call it Eretz Yisrael, in the land of Israel. Many such structures were put into place. Ultimately, there is something called the Jewish Agency, which was essentially a government that wasn't really a government because there wasn't a state. It was a pre-government, I guess you would say. All these things were put in place. They all began with the first World Zionist Congress. Ultimately, Herzl sees what a big project this is. And he's so anxious to save Jews. And what's important to him is a state for Jews rather than a historical connection to some Jewish piece of geography, that he is willing to consider other real estate for that state, at least temporarily. What's the most famous of those other people? Uganda. The Brits want to sort of solve some of their problems by diverting him to Uganda, and Herzl's willing to consider it. And at the Fourth World Zionist Congress, who are the people that shoot it down? The Eastern European Jews. Who were the ones being persecuted and dying? The ones he was trying to save. And they said, are you high? No. It's Eretz Yisrael, or it's nowhere. We're not going to Central Africa. Only to Eretz Yisrael. I believe he died of a broken heart. I can't prove that, but I think that all of that travel, all that effort, all that energy wore him down, and then this huge disappointment where his own people, the very people he was trying to save, essentially spit on him at the Fourth World Zionist Congress, and he dies shortly after that. Okay. Do we understand what Herzl was trying to do? He was trying to solve the problem of anti-Semitism. We said that first they had to establish a state. Then what's next in Herzl's program? What has to happen? Everybody has to come. And what's the problem with that idea? Is everybody going to come? This is the beginning of the 20th century. Where did all of our, nearly, I'm guessing, all of our ancestors come? They came here. If they left, and the fortunate ones left, as it turned out, from what we know about the middle of the 20th century. My grandfather, my grandmother, they came here. Were they anti-Zionist? I don't think it was even on their radar screen. In other words, where did they want to go? They wanted to go to the Golden Medina, right, where the streets were paved with gold. The Lower East Side of New York paved with gold, right? But which we're so nostalgic over these days. It was horrible. Anyway, but they came here. What Herzl didn't understand is that Western European Jews, Central European Jews, were probably not going to accept his analysis. Whether they intellectually agreed with it or not, they weren't actually emotionally and physically going to accept it. And Eastern European Jews, who needed to get away from anti-Semitism, because in Central and Western Europe it was, what shall we call it, genteel anti-Semitism. It was real, it was serious, it was hurtful, it was bad. But generally, there were not pogroms in France. There were not pogroms in England, right? It wasn't exactly the same thing. Those were happening in Eastern Europe, in Russia, and Ukraine, and Belarus. But those people weren't, by and large, choosing to go to Eretz Israel to build a state. They were going to America. Okay, so there's a big problem with Herzl. Number one, he's got to establish a state. Number two, he's got to figure out how to convince the Jewish people to go there. And then all the other things that are obviously going to be that are going to follow that are practical concerns. Now, why am I belaboring all of this? Because Herzl, even though he's the father of political Zionism, and without Herzl, we don't get the World Zionist Congress, and without the World Zionist Congresses, I do not believe that we get the State of Israel. He's critical. But is his opinion the only opinion? Is his thinking among Zionists? There's lots of Zionists, by the way. Lots and lots of Zionist thinkers. A guy named Herzberg wrote a book called The Zionist Idea, if you really want to look into this, and it's been recently reissued. Arthur Herzberg died 10, 15 years ago, but the book was sort of updated and improved and was reissued, and I don't remember who reissued it. Might have been Jewish Publication Society or Shokin, one of them. And it's really quite good because you will see a full range of Zionist ideas that probably you've never been exposed to. Yes? What name was it? I didn't catch the name. Oh, no. You're talking about Shabbatai Tzvi. Yeah, he lives about 500 years before this. No. Shabbatai Tzvi early and late Enlightenment, it's true he claimed to be the Messiah. He didn't claim to be a Zionist. He claimed to be the Messiah. And his followers, hundreds of thousands of followers, and ultimately the Sultan gave him a choice between conversion to Islam and death. And he chose conversion. Anyhow, that's long before this story. Marsha. I can't hear you, Marsha. You're going to have to pull that down. Eliezer ben Yehuda. Was he a Zionist? Yeah, but mostly he was a linguist. Meaning it was essential what he did, and I'm going to get to that in a minute. So if I don't, remind me. And by the way, what Joel just said is there are actually still a handful of Sabbateans around. Maybe he was referring to them, but Jews are not immune to believing poppycock nonsense. in my view, where it's not just other peoples and other religious groups that we point the finger at and say, "How could you believe that?" I'm always astounded when somebody, frankly, again, you never know what's being recorded for posterity, right? Posterity here. That when Jews say, "How can Christians possibly believe the things that they believe?" Really, how can Jews believe the things that we believe about Torah and Mount Sinai and and God singling us out and all this kind of stuff? Every religious tradition has things that, if you put it under the microscope, look pretty weird to somebody who isn't already committed to them. But Sabbateans were really wacko. Really, they were really wacko. They were completely out there. Anyhow, one of the key people is this guy, HaAm. So if you look at the second set of papers, he's born in 1856. He lives to 1927, so he has a longer life. Mostly an essayist, thinker, philosopher. Okay. If you look there at that top paragraph, it tells you what his key idea is. And since this may be new to you, I think it's worth looking at that. According to Louis Jacobs, and I believe he is correct, he developed the idea of Palestine as a spiritual center for Jews everywhere. He opposed Herzl as having too political and uncultural view of Zionism. For him, resettling the land had to mean reviving Jewish culture. Okay, this is very, very important, because HaAm looks at what Herzl has to say, and he says, Herzl, all you're concerned with is the body of the Jewish people, that we're being beaten up, destroyed by anti-Semitism. Our body is suffering, and you are looking for a solution to that problem. Therefore, you have a physical solution for it, a physical state on a physical land. He said, but that's not our real problem. The real Jewish problem is how much our spirit has been damaged by anti-Semitism. For HaAm, he felt that centuries of looking over our shoulder at dominant cultures that rejected us and vilified us has caused a kind of self-hatred, has caused us to be spiritually ill. And he said our soul, the Jewish soul, meaning the soul of the Jewish people, has to be healed. And he saw the way to do that was by creating a cultural center in the land of Israel. And from that cultural center, you would think of it as sort of the center of a wagon wheel. All the spokes would radiate out to the Jewish world everywhere, helping to heal our soul through the development of Jewish culture in the Jewish land that is not looking over its shoulder at dominant cultures that revile us and hate us. Does that make sense? Did I say that at all clearly? Okay. He knows that the Jews en masse are not making Aliyah to the land of Israel. He knows that. So what he's interested in is those people who do go to the land of Israel establishing a Jewish center there, not a center for Jews, not a center of and by Jews, but a Jewish center, and that culture will then radiate out. Now, we can read through some of this, but frankly, I would rather talk to you about it and get your kind of feedback. So we understand Herzl. Who's with Herzl here? I am. Why am I with Herzl? Because in one way, Herzl was correct, an important way. He may have been wrong about Jews, the mass of Jews, all going to the land of Israel. But if you look at the last 70 years, 70 plus years in the land of Israel, he was right about the state at least being a partial, if not a big piece of a solution to anti-Semitism. Who lives in the state of Israel now? By the way, you know that Israel is the largest Jewish community, contrary to what a couple people at Brandeis say. Leonard Sachs being one of them. If you follow, he's one of the, I call them happy sociologists. You know, there are happy sociologists that look at the numbers and spin them that everything is cherry pie. And then there are the sad sociologists who look at the same numbers and tell you everything that's wrong and how we're about to fall off the edge of the world. He's a happy sociologist, in my opinion, and you may have read someplace that there are many million more Jews in the United States than we thought before. Did you read? That was a big story about 6 months ago, 8 months ago. Yeah, if you play around enough with the definition of who's a Jew and who you're counting in your totals, and if you're counting anybody who lives in a household with somebody who's Jewish, you get to be pretty big numbers. But if you're talking about committed Jews, or even just those Jews who self-identify as Jews in some sort of serious way, we're significantly under 6 million in the United States. I believe we are under 5 million in the United States, and those numbers are only going like this. How do I know that? Because I know what the Jewish birth rate is in the United States. Some of you have heard me ride this hobby horse before. What is the Jewish birth rate in the United States? 1.7 per couple. What's replacement? At least 2.2. Now, I could debate whether my brother is that 0.2 or not, but you all get my point. We're like half a point below replacement, which means that our numbers are declining. And you don't have to take my word for it. Just look around the Jewish community of Dayton, or any other Jewish community you want to look at. I have a friend who's a rabbi on Long Island who's complaining about the same demographics that we are concerned with here. Where is that not true? In the state of Israel, where the secular Jews have 3, 4, and 5 children each. And I don't know what it is, but I think it's something like 2.8 or something like that is what I don't think that's counting the Haredim. The Haredim average about 6 plus. So in whatever else you want to say about them, and you know I have a lot to say about them, they are producing a lot of children. In my town, where Simone and I live, the town is literally filthy with children. There are 6 kindergartens, 6 preschools and kindergartens within 1 block of our apartment. And that's true all over town. It's not like I live in a special part of town. The demographics of Modin, Israel, someone once told me, are the same as the Gaza Strip, which is the most densely populated piece of real estate in the world. Anyhow, Israel already has more Jews than we have. And those numbers are going to climb, and our numbers, sadly, I would not like to have to say this, are probably going to decline. Okay, back to my point. Who lives there in Israel? Let's talk about all of the Jews that came to Israel following the Second World War, apart from the ones that were there beforehand that immigrated from Eastern Europe, but the big immigrations. Lots and lots of Polish Jews. Lots and lots of Moroccan Jews. Lots and lots of Iraqi Jews. What happened after the State of Israel was declared in 1948? What happened to the Jews in Arab lands? Just of their own free will? Yes, they were pretty much kicked out of Egypt, Iraq, and Iran, and they're not Arabs, but Iran and Syria and North Africa. You know, you might just want to keep that in mind when you hear about the refugee problem. The refugee problem is always defined in a certain way, but the difference is the Jewish refugees were welcomed in where they want and assimilated and turned into Israelis, which didn't happen with the other part of the refugee problem. It's a much more complicated story than usually our media lays it out to be. About what?
About the waves of immigration coming in the late 40s and early 50s in terms of Israel's ability to...
Oh, of course. No, think about this. What does it mean to accept it? There's always controversy. We're talking Jews here. But you think that the Jewish culture of 2 Jews, 3 opinions only exists in the United States? No. You have 6.5 million Jews there. At least 12 million opinions. Jewish opinion. I'm not joking. Everything, it's both the most attractive and the least attractive aspect of Israeli life. The negotiation never ends. Over everything. Whatever it is. All right. I won't slide into stories that I could tell you about that because it's really off topic. Okay, but my point is, all of these groups were beleaguered Jewish groups who had a place to go. Not only that, a place that wanted them, at least in theory. and one of the things that's true about Israeli life still to this day is every Israeli loves Aliyah, immigration. They just aren't so sure about Olim, immigrants. It's sort of like in the United States, isn't it? Give me your huddled masses, except for the real people who are coming in. It's always a problem. You can intellectually be in favor of immigration, but actually accepting immigrants, that's another story. But Israel essentially did. For all the problems, absorbing the so-called Edot HaMizrach, the communities of the East, we sometimes call them Sephardic Jews, but they aren't really Sephardic Jews. They're Eastern Jews. They were more or less absorbed, and they are full parts of Israeli society. You can say that about the Ethiopians. You remember this in the 1980s? Operation Moses and Operation Solomon. It's the only time Caucasian people went to Africa and brought African people out to make them citizens in the country that they were bringing them to. That happened. And it happened in the 1990s. You remember this? I'm sure you remember it here because not all of the Russians went to Israel. Many of them stopped in Germany and found their way here on their way. And the Jewish world worked very hard everywhere to accept them, absorb them, assimilate them. That was true in Israel, except they didn't really have the resources to do it. This is before startup nation. This is before Israel was a first world country. But it didn't matter because they were living out Herzl's dream that there needs to be a Jewish state for beleaguered Jews to go to solve the Jewish problem for them. So I would argue that this is, Herzl's thinking is still a big part of what the modern state of Israel is all about. And even for those of us in the United States who didn't go, what did many American Jews think? I'll talk about my family. My parents had this little aphorism, I'm sure your family had it too, that if you're Jewish, your passport should always be current. What did that mean? You didn't grow up with that? You didn't talk to your parents enough. What did it mean that your passport should always be current? the history of anti-Semitism was such as that you should always be ready. And where was the one place that would take you in? Israel. This was... What? You do? For that reason? Not only in Eastern Europe, but in Central Europe. Yes? I would say Herzl was right. It was the most serious problem. Right. Yeah. They did. They did. They were the Egyptians. They did. But my point, I'm not trying to minimize this. I'm agreeing with you. Is that what Herzl was saying, in essence, if he had had a conversation with the HaAm, fine, you can talk about spirituality, but until we solve the problems of the body, there is no issue with the spirit. When they're killing you, all that matters is that they're killing you. When they're beating you, all that matters is that they're beating you. And so he had a point. He may have taken it too far. He may have, his 19th century kind of utopian thinking may have caused him to express this and to view this in a way that was too exaggerated. But his essential point, I would argue, is correct. Now let's look at Ginsburg. So Ginsburg, knowing that the Jews are not going to go, I think also is correct in his diagnosis that the Jewish people spiritually was ill. Not just because Freud was Jewish, but spiritually was ill, right? That we had spent centuries since the Romans living as a minority culture who maybe was tolerated, and those were the good times. And there were lots of those also. However, somewhere in the world, at every time in history, Jews were being persecuted. It's not the same thing as saying all Jews were being persecuted all the time, everywhere. But somewhere in the world, whatever time period you want to pick, we can find where the Jews of a given time were persecuted. That's why Jews are kind of considered the canary of hatred. If you want to see what's going on in the hatred in the world, look and see what's happening vis-a-vis anti-Semitism and the Jews. It's sort of the surest marker, indicator. Anyway, he understood that centuries of this had damaged the Jewish spirit and that the Jewish spirit needed to recover. Now, why do I find this so essential? Because as I look at the state of Israel, certainly the state of Israel that I have experienced, I began experiencing the state of Israel firsthand in the summer of 1971. Israel was a third world country. Were any of you there then? Before the 1970s? I mean, literally a third world country. There were donkeys in the street pulling wagons and selling watermelons and selling kerosene. Because if you wanted heat, you had to have a kerosene heater. Nobody had central heat. There was none of that. It was a third world country by and large. I had to get typhoid shots before I went. And what's the other one? Cholera. The State Department recommended that I have a cholera shot and 2 typhoid shots before I went to Israel the first time. And I will tell you what a reaction to a vaccine is from those typhoid shots. Anyway, I couldn't lift my arm from the time they put it in till when I walked out of the doctor's office. But my point is, it was a third world country, but already you could start to sense the rebuilding of Jewish culture. Now this developed over time. Certainly when we lived there in the 1980s, the country had developed significantly. When in the 1970s there was a 2-lane road between Tel Aviv and Jerusalem. I considered it a modern miracle every time I was on that road. Because the bus would be going up to Jerusalem, and there not only would be a car coming down at us, but another one passing it. On a 2-lane road, and we were about to fall over the cliff, and somehow we never did. It was like a modern miracle. But that's what the nature of the roads were. Already there were highways in the 80s, like what we recognize as highways. And of course in the 90s, later, you begin to get Startup Nation and the development of this first world country and economy that exists there now. But through it all, what has developed with it, not just economically and not just militarily, not just in terms of protecting the body of the Jewish people, but our spirit. Marcia's point. Can you give me another example of a language? It was never dead because it was always written and read. But a non-spoken language, a language that had not been actually spoken by very many people for centuries, that was resurrected successfully. They've been working on Gaelic for decades. But modern Hebrew, I can tell you, because as someone who struggles to learn new words every day, is a full-blown modern language that is fully expressive. Out of the Bible, where there are only about 1,000 distinct roots in the whole Bible. How does that happen? Except for the creation of the Hebrew Academy, not Hebrew University, the Academy of Hebrew Language, whose job it is to develop the language, culture. Do you remember a time here when the music in synagogues, particularly Reform synagogues, because that's what I know best and probably most of you know best, moved away from the Germanic-sounding hymns that dominated our worship to music that was actually Israeli. Like, do you remember when Oseh Shalom came in? Da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da. Who doesn't know that? Where did it come from? Music, dance, literature, language. There are more yeshiva students in Jerusalem now than all the yeshiva students who ever lived together. Think about that for a second. In a way, it's too bad, but how many yeshivot does there have to be for that to be true? Not just in Jerusalem, but also in Bnei Brak and in all sorts of towns and cities all across Israel in which traditional Torah studies are going on. Israel, 9 million people. How many universities are there? 7. Hebrew University, Tel Aviv University, Haifa University. That doesn't count the private university that's in Herzliya, IDC. It doesn't count all of what are called the Michlalot, which are what we would call colleges. We might call them junior colleges or specialty colleges that are dotted all over the country. Higher education everywhere. Degrees everywhere. How does all this happen? How do you get language and learning and dance and art? And because Israel understood that it needed to be a cultural center, and that if it was a cultural center, that would radiate out to the rest of the Jewish world everywhere. Do you think I'm right or wrong about that? Don't all talk at once. Felix. Balfour? Are you talking about the non-Jewish fellow? Well, Balfour's not Jewish. The Balfour Declaration which sort of gave legitimacy to the notion of a state. Although if you read the Balfour Declaration, it doesn't actually say state in it. But it was used by the Zionists as a precedent, as a document to rely on to justify the creation of the state. He wasn't the only one. We could spend hours and hours actually talking about how a Herzlian idea became reality. But what I want you to see, because you know that this is my approach, is a rationale for understanding what the state of Israel is. The state of Israel, we all understand, almost instinctively, intuitively, is a safe haven. And we want that safe haven, if not for ourselves, although I believe lots of us want it for ourselves, and I think in the last 10 years, more and more American Jews have felt that way. If not for ourselves, we want it for other Jews. Right? We want someplace for former Soviet Jews to go. We want someplace for the Ethiopians to go. We want someplace. When the things happened in Paris, remember this is just a handful of years ago. When the things happened in Paris, the Jews that left, by the way, Netanyahu got that completely wrong among the long list of things that he's gotten completely wrong, where he thought, all the Jews of France are now going to come to Israel. Remember, he went and stuck his foot in his mouth. He went to Paris on French soil and said, you're welcome, all come. It didn't sit too well with the French president at the time. But did they come? Actually, only a handful of them, comparatively speaking, a handful. But they had a place to go. When we're worried about the Jews of Argentina, or Chile, or now Brazil, they have a place to go. And it's sort of like home is defined as the place where they have to let you in, right? Okay, that's the way Israel defines itself. I believe it is pure Herzlian. On the other hand, if Israel was only a safe haven for Jews, I don't think it would occupy our attention. I don't think it would be as important as it is. It certainly would not have attracted me to go live there. Speaking first person singular, I think I can probably speak for Simone also on this regard. Why? Because we wouldn't have felt threatened. We didn't move there because we felt threatened. Indeed, in the United States, and now I know I'm about to ride a hobby horse that people are going to get upset at. Somebody introduced me on Sunday, Rick introduced me on Sunday morning as intentionally saying things that are controversial to stir people up so that they'll pay attention. I have to admit that sometimes I do that. But sometimes they're actually my ideas and they just stir people up. Okay, this is one of them. In the United States, there are serious anti-Semitic incidents that cannot be tolerated and have to be dealt with. But there is not the anti-Semitism that I grew up with in the 1950s. In the 1950s, I graduated high school in 1968. In 1968, everybody knew there was a 10% quota at Northwestern University. It was a 10% Catholic quota also. That's absurd today. Why was there a Jewish hospital in Cincinnati or in St. Louis or Michael Reese in Chicago? Because Jewish doctors didn't have any other place to practice. And so the Jewish community created these hospitals for them. That's absurd today to think that that would be the case. I'm not minimizing the anti-Semitic incidents or how terrible they are or what happened in Pittsburgh or California or any of the other places. Believe me, I'm not. I'm just saying it's different than the kind of structural anti-Semitism that Felix was talking about where people couldn't work or they couldn't live or they were denied access to trades. When my father was a young man, I never quite understood this, but he told me he wanted to be an FBI agent. There was no chance. Why was there no chance? He was Jewish. It's that simple. And then when he was born, he graduated high school in 1941. There was no chance that he was going to be an FBI agent. When Simone graduated from college, 1973, she talked to recruiters in the State Department because she knows languages, right? They told her she could apply, but she shouldn't really expect to get very far. 1973. However, today, all of that is absurd. And so what I am suggesting is for my children, they've never really experienced anti-Semitism. And certainly my grandchildren have no idea of it at all. The 14-year-old, that's our oldest grandchild, has no notion of what anti-Semitism is, except for something that she's read in books. Americans are not going to go to Israel because they feel threatened. Why do Americans go to Israel? Well, the religious ones go because they're attracted to their Jewish religious culture. And those of us that don't fall into the Orthodox framework, we are attracted to the rest of the culture, which is Jewish, just not Orthodox religious Jewish. Is that making sense to anybody? That's why I think you have to know both Herzl and HaAm if you want to have a theoretical framework to understand what the state of Israel is really all about. Okay, I think I saw some people twitching. Does anybody want to comment? Yes.
I agree that we really don't know. I think anti-Semitism is much more ingrained and a little bit more subtle. I mean, red line period. I moved to Dayton the first time in 73. There were 2 Jews in Oakland, and they both positions. Now there's about it.
Yeah, I don't think I was in Dayton on my first trip for an interview 5 seconds before I heard about Oakwood. Really? Even though in 2003, the greatest concentration of Jews in the Dayton area is in Oakwood. And it was true then. But still, within 5 seconds, because everybody knew I had to find a place to live. So the first thing was Oakwood, because we looked at some places in Oakwood. And when we finally moved to the Oregon district, people who lived in this town all their lives said to me, "What did you do, rent an apartment over a bar?" I said, "There's a neighborhood there?" Really? Yes.
Talk about anti-Semitism, and I think you're right, relative to, I think, my own kids' reaction in terms of what they've experienced. However, when you look at university campuses now, and the anti-Semitism has morphed, I don't know that it's against necessarily the Jews living in the United States as much as it's transformed into an anti-Israeli.
Well, all right, so what you're raising, which is a very important subject, I just think it's sort of another subject for another time, is anti-Israel equivalent to anti-Semitic? And I would answer, sometimes it is, sometimes it isn't. I am not at all happy with what's going on college campuses. Everybody knows that I'm a left-of-center guy. However, there are significant problems, certainly more to the left than I am, in terms of what I think is pretty close or actually blatant anti-Semitism. However, let's not forget the clearer, more obvious blatant anti-Semitism that's on the right. And so both are problematic. I'm not saying there's no anti-Semitism in the United States. There is. It's a real problem. I am not minimizing it, except I also don't want to exaggerate it in a kind of way Herzl did into saying that it's a structural issue in American society the way it once was. I can give you other examples of this. My father, I keep using my father, but he's the generation before me, and so it was when it was the most obvious. He was a tax accountant. Actually, he didn't want to be a tax accountant. But he couldn't have been a tax accountant because he couldn't work for one of the 6 big firms, which I can't remember what they were. I guess at one time there were 6 big tax accounting firms across the country. And it's unbelievable to me now to think that such firms didn't hire Jews in accounting. It's like absurd today to think that way. But it was true when I was a kid in the 1950s. And so I just want us to be realistic about this and to understand why it is that Israel is not, since I'm talking about Zionism tonight, to understand why it is that Americans are not going to go to Israel based upon a fear for their safety in the United States.
And we're also seeing in the last few years outrages, Ginsburg, California, others.
Okay.
We hadn't seen, that didn't even seem to go on.
Oh, it did go on.
25 years ago at that magnitude.
It did go on. It just, there was not the same kind of media, and it was different kinds of things. Do you remember a guy named George Lincoln Rockwell? He was the head of the American Nazi Party. That was a structural kind of thing that was in the United States. Where I grew up in St. Louis, it was a big deal. You know, these kind of, probably in Cincinnati too, these Germanic towns, it was a very big deal. When I'm saying it, I can be direct, but I won't be. I'll just sort of ask the question amorphously. Is there anybody in this room who planned to make Aliyah after Pittsburgh? No. Me. Yeah, but we were planning it anyway. Now, do you follow what I'm getting? There's a difference between anti-Semitism being real and it being so structural and so gigantic and burdensome that it actually would cause you to uproot your life and to move to Israel. You know what it must mean for people? That's why they weren't going to come from France either, except for a handful. But they did come from the former Soviet Union. More than 1 million came in the 1990s because their life was entirely curtailed because they were Jews. They didn't even know what it meant to be Jew. It was on their identity card. The ones that I dealt with, we had to teach them everything from square one about what it meant to be Jewish. They just knew that they couldn't do this, they couldn't be that, they couldn't go here, they couldn't do that, because on their identity card it said Jew. Their entire life was curtailed, and so they were willing to pick up their lives. And whether it was to go to Central Europe, to Germany and stay, or to go to the United States, which was not easy either, or to go to Israel, where I can tell you it was not easy. You know that there were some number of mining engineers came from the former Soviet Union to Israel. Do you know how many mines there are in the state of Israel? It was a big deal. These people pushed brooms. Why did they do it? Do you follow what I'm getting at? Because they needed to, based like what Herzl would have predicted. But for the rest of us, and even for them once they got settled, what makes Israel Israel is the culture. Is the culture. If you have a grandchild who's being bar mitzvah, where are you going to get that grandchild, that grandson's bar mitzvah talis? You going to go to the Lower East Side? Does it exist there? You going to drive up to Cleveland? If you do, I can tell you where it came from, the one that's in Cleveland. Right? Do you get that? Okay. And then I'll give it to you, Felix. I'm going to answer. I just don't want. I don't want to lose my voice. I am no longer in vocal shape. I don't talk like this anymore. Okay. The answer is certainly intellectually. The answer is yes. His question was, does the government of the state of Israel actually want Aliyah? And I think that the answer is an unqualified yes. However, the actual process of Aliyah and the absorption of Olim, of immigrants, is a much stickier, trickier issue, which is to be expected. So let me give you an example. One of my complaints, we made Aliyah, we did it the easy way. We're living on our American savings, our retirement savings. I don't have to have a job there. I don't have a mortgage from an Israeli bank. We already knew Hebrew in a passable way. We already had friends there. We already had an apartment that we owned. But imagine if you're somebody who came from the former Soviet Union. Or better yet, Imagine you're somebody who wants to come from France as a result of what happened in Paris. And let's say you're a professional. Let's say you're a pharmacist. I actually have a real person in mind who I know this. What happens when you make Aliyah? You have no trouble making Aliyah. You're a citizen. You get your ID card. They even give you some money at the airport to help tide you over for a few weeks. It's actually weird. They hand you an envelope with cash in it, just so that you can go to a grocery store and buy groceries right off the bat. Okay? If you know how to do it. And what is the first thing you're going to want to do? Get a job. And you're a pharmacist, so what kind of job do you want to get? As a pharmacist. But what do you have to do in order to get that job as a pharmacist? You have to get your credentials recognized. Now, you know what it takes to get your credentials recognized here if you're a foreigner? It's not so easy. It's at least that hard in Israel. So if you're a lawyer, or you're a pharmacist, or a doctor, or an Indian chief, and you come to Israel, and you want to work in your chosen field, you have to deal with all the doctors, and all the lawyers, and all the pharmacists, and all the Indian chiefs that are already there, and the rules that they have put in place, frankly, to protect themselves. No different than any other first world country. But it still means that you may not be able to work. So I'm just giving you an example of that, and then you rent an apartment, but you want to buy an apartment. And I've told you what real estate costs in the state of Israel. How do you do that? And you have to get your kids in school, which is a whole educational bureaucracy, but your Hebrew is certainly not good enough to read all the forms. So you need help. Well, there are organizations that will help you. But everything that we take for granted here, when you applied for Social Security, was that a picnic? Relatively easy, but still confuses a lot of people. Now imagine if you were coming here and you didn't know English. And your language wasn't Spanish. Right? Just think about how complicated it would be just to do a simple thing like filling out a form. So when you say, are they in favor of Aliyah? They're in favor of Aliyah. Do they make it as easy as possible for actual immigrants? The answer is no. But it's a real country. It's not really to be expected that would be the case. But still, there's a lot of improvement that they can make. No, it was what you're talking about. Maybe you've heard this term. It was called a ma'abara, which means like roughly a transit camp. They were tents. If you want to see what this might have been like, get a hold of the movie Sala, with the first movie with Topol in it, in which it's about Moroccans who came at the same time, and they're living in a tent kind of city. Israel was a third world country. It took these people in because it believed it should take them in, not because it could afford to. So, absolutely it was worse then. No doubt, absolutely worse then. But that doesn't mean that for Westerners now, most Americans who make Aliyah return to the United States within 3 years. And it's because it's not the 51st state. It's a whole different culture. It's a whole different... when you go as a tourist, everybody seems to speak English. They don't. Everybody you talk to seems to be friendly. They aren't. Every place that you go seems to cater to your needs. It's not that way. And so when you actually go there to live, and you come up against this, and you can return home because there's not a sword hanging over anybody's head at home, what happens? Most of them come home. meaning they come back to the United States. Karen. Yeah, it's very tribal, for both good and bad. So to your first comment, which is why I am agreeing that we have to take anti-Semitism seriously. We have to do, as a community, we have to be organized and ready and vigilant to make sure that we aren't on a slippery slope. Because I agree, it's if you take your eye off the ball. But that's not the same thing as making it worse than it is, which prevents you from doing other things. Okay. Your second point, it's what attracts me also. So Israel is oppressively close. Everybody is in everybody's business. Okay? And that is something that this American, has trouble with. On the other hand, when we returned from the United States twice last year and had to be in quarantine for 2 weeks, all I had to do was to send a WhatsApp to either my friends or people in the building, because we couldn't even leave the apartment to take our garbage downstairs. Or we needed groceries bought for us, or whatever it was that we needed to do. And immediately people respond in the positive. Because there is this sense of family, for lack of a better word, of tribe, and that leads to an experience of communal life in a way that is harder to experience in the United States. I think that the reason for synagogues is this is where we have a chance of establishing that kind of experience here. But if you want to think of it this way, I see you nodding your head, Israel is like 100% synagogue. That's an exaggeration, but that's the plus about it. Everything that's a plus is a minus. Everything that's a minus is a plus. And it either attracts you or it doesn't. But the culture, whether it's the music or the art or the technology, it's all there. Did you want to say something, Richard? Did I see? We're at the point where we have 3 or 4 minutes again. And you can read HaAm's own words there when he essentially, in his way, says what I hope I've been telling you was his response to Herzl. So, anybody else? Okay, so does everybody know what he's talking about? So the first president of the State of Israel is this guy named Weitzman, right? Who actually was a chemist, and he was very instrumental in coming up with an explosive that the Brits were very fond of. And he was president of the World Zionist Congress, and some people think he was essential because of that relationship that he had with in mandatory times with the British. There is an Institute of Technology, which I didn't name in the list of universities, that is in Rehovot. It's the next town from where we live, which is called the Weitzman Institute. And it's entirely dedicated to science and technology. And it is a powerhouse kind of place. But it's not the only one. It's just very famous. Hebrew University, Tel Aviv University, Haifa University, the Technion, which we could have named also, which is also a powerhouse in terms of Bar Ilan, which has much more of a kind of religious bent. There are all these universities, all of these schools, all of these yeshivot, all of the language, all of the literature. Yes? We've known each other 18 years, Richard. Israel still produces Nobel Prize winners. The Jewish people still produces Nobel Prize winners. And that should be a point of pride with us, which I think is what you were going for. I have a little problem with it when we use it as a stick, as a weapon, to show our superiority. Look at how many Nobel Prize winners we have versus how many do you have? Meaning whoever the other is. I get sort of tense and nervous with that kind of use. There's lots and lots I'm very proud of Israeli culture, of all the things that I've been talking about, the creation of the language. But that doesn't mean that we should be pointing the finger at other people who are trying to recreate their language and say, what's wrong with you? Why aren't you succeeding where we succeeded? I just think that there's a line that we have to be careful of, where pride becomes something other than pride. So is the implication that having to deal with anti-Semitism acts as a kind of inducement towards higher achievement? I think that could be true.
The Nobel Prize is primarily an academic award, and academia was one place that Jews could work as chemists, as physicists, etc. That was open.
I would have a different analysis of the same thing is what Jews had as a result of anti-Semitism. The only natural resource that they had was brain power. So it developed. You could make the same argument for the state of Israel. What is the natural resource of the state of Israel? Sand. Seriously, what's the natural resource? A lot of potash comes out of the Dead Sea, which is also why the Dead Sea is shrinking and will disappear. The Dead Sea is dying, if you don't know that. It will be completely dead probably in about 75 or 80 years. The whole southern end of it is gone. And the northern end, which is where it's really deep, given the way it's being utilized and the fact that there isn't much water coming into it from the Jordan River anymore due to irrigation, it's drying up also. But apart from that potash, the Dead Sea works, if any of you have ever been there, and sand, so you can make a lot of glass, I guess. What does the state of Israel as a Jewish state, what's its natural resource? Brain power, human talent. So, and I think we should be proud of this. I'm just cautioning that there's a difference between pride and Arrogance. Very good. Thank you. And arrogance. Okay. So hopefully what you got by talking about these 8 people in these last 4 weeks are some ways of thinking about Jewish life, religious Jewish life, God, the state of Israel, that maybe you hadn't thought about before. If that's true, then I will have considered it well worth the effort, and I appreciate you listening. So thank you.